Hey everyone. One of my favorite things about One Piece has to be its ensemble cast. The Straw Hats are probably my favorite ensemble cast in all of fiction. There's just something about the banter they have with one another and their incredible resolve to follow their captain no matter what that really endears me to them. But when it comes to ensemble casts, I think one of the most fun things to do as a fan is to try and rank the characters. Now, I don't mean rank based on strength or anything like that, but just purely based on which character is your favorite. And throughout my time reading One Piece, I found that when I would rank the crew, no matter which arc I was on, I'd always place the same Straw Hat at the bottom of my list. That Straw Hat, unfortunately, is Franky. Now, what's funny is that as I was reading the manga on the Shonen Jump app, I would see the various popularity polls that Weekly Shonen Jump would conduct, and be surprised to learn that I was not alone on this. Of the 7 official popularity polls, Franky was only introduced in the series by the time of the 3rd poll. Between the 5 polls he was featured in, he was the least popular Straw Hat in all but one of them. The only time he wasn't the least popular was in the 5th poll, where he placed just above Brook. Interestingly though, this poll was conducted late into the Dressrosa arc, an arc where half the crew, including Brook, were absent for most of it, giving Franky some time to shine and an unfair advantage when it came time to vote. Now this has led me to wonder why I and apparently many members of the fanbase discount Franky. Well, after doing some research and comparing Franky to the other Straw Hats, I've identified some fairly significant differences between Franky and the rest of the Straw Hats that may be at the root of the issue. Before getting into those differences, I want to make it clear that I'm not going to be making arguments against Franky's post-time skip design or things like his eccentric personality, like how he says super a million times, as I think while those are often cited reasons for people's dislike of his character, they feel like very shallow reasons that don't get at the actual root of what I believe holds Franky back from being a more popular Straw Hat. The first problem that Franky has to deal with is that he simply isn't a legacy character. Luffy, Zoro, Nami, Usopp, and Sanji are the foundation of One Piece, and will forever be prioritized by Oda when it comes to who gets the most screen time, the most monumental fights, and the most important scenes in the story. They're the pillars of the franchise and are so iconic that even those who don't watch or read One Piece would recognize their faces. Before I even read One Piece myself or even cared about anime or manga, I recognized the 5 characters from just various promotional art that I had seen on the internet. I realize this is unfair to Franky as he has the disadvantage of being introduced over 300 chapters into the story, but that's just the way it is. Even in the post-time skip era where the Straw Hats seem to occupy a background role all too often, Oda never seems to forget his core members of the crew. Zoro always gets one of the biggest fights of an arc, Sanji literally had an arc dedicated to him, and Nami, who despite getting a bit shafted nowadays, still was given significant screen time alongside Luffy during Whole Cake Island. And when it came time to fight the Beast Pirates at Onigashima, Nami ended up fighting Ulti of the Tobiropo, who was easily the most heavily featured and fleshed out member of that faction. So even in an arc where there are so many characters for Oda to juggle, and nearly every Straw Hat had a one-on-one battle, Nami's opponent was given a little extra significance. Meanwhile, Franky fought Sasaki, who was honestly the most forgettable member of the Tobiropo. I think it's fair to also mention that I don't think Usopp has been given as much attention as the East Blue 5 post-time skip. Minus the God Usopp story at Dressrosa, he's been shafted pretty heavily. But let's not forget that the next likely arc is Elbaf, which has been built up throughout the series as the Usopp arc since Little Garden. So yeah, Oda never forgets his core crew. It's perfectly fine for stories to have a core group within an ensemble. Most ensembles are written so that the original members of the group are always in the forefront. But as you'll see later, there's more to Franky besides not being a core character that still holds him back. Before moving on to my next point, I want to also quickly add Chopper as a member of this legacy group. He's been around for close to as long as the East Blue 5, and he's the mascot of One Piece. Being a mascot character gives Chopper a unique position in the crew, where even if he isn't relevant in the story, as long as he just kind of sits there and looks adorable, people will like him. And having the same Japanese voice actress as Pikachu doesn't hurt either. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's look at the second issue with Franky's character, which is Water 7. By the time we reached Water 7, we had been conditioned to expect that every Straw Hat would get an arc dedicated to them. Typically an arc that would center around their personal conflict, they get an emotional backstory, and then end up joining the crew. Zoro had Shell's Town, Usopp had Syrup Village, Sanji had Baratie, Nami had Arlong Park, and Chopper had Drum Island. Well, the problem here is that Robin had already joined the crew before Water 7 and hadn't had her own arc yet, so Oda ended up making Water 7 her arc. What we had here is essentially two Straw Hats having to share an arc, and the share wasn't exactly 50-50. While both characters received emotional backstories, I think most fans can agree that the Ohara flashback is way more iconic than Franky's, although I do still really love his backstory, I should mention. But what's worse is that while Franky was incredibly important to the Water 7 saga, he wasn't at the center of the story. Like I mentioned earlier, every Straw Hat's arc was essentially centered around that character's personal conflict, and in Water 7, the conflict of the arc was to save Robin by invading Enies lobby. Franky was there and he had his standout moments for sure, but Robin took the brunt of the focus. When you also factor in how Usopp received a lot of individual character development this arc, Franky doesn't really seem to have a chance to stand out. It's especially noticeable how shafted Franky is when we get to the next arc, Thriller Bark. This arc was essentially Brook's arc. Not to the same extent as the first 7 Straw Hats, but retrieving his shadow is a major goal for the crew. Moria does end up stealing a few of the other Straw Hats' shadows, so their investment in the arc does go beyond the skeleton, but Brook's story does still bookend the arc, with his flashback in the epilogue being one of the most tragic in the entire series. Compare this to Franky, and he just really looks like the odd man out in this scenario. I don't think it was necessarily a mistake for Oda to have Franky share an arc with Robin and Usopp. Water 7 is an arc that I really wouldn't want to change in any way. I think just like how Nami, Robin, and even Sanji received further developments several arcs after joining the crew, I think Franky could have been just another character who gets more to work with post-introduction. But that unfortunately leads to my third point, and this is the first point that I would actually blame on the writing. My third point is that throughout post-timeskip, which is the majority of the time Franky has been a member of the crew, he hasn't actually developed as a character. Now this might sound weird to say, as really most of the Straw Hats don't grow past the same personality and quirks they had upon their introduction. This is true for the most part, but what Oda does give the Straw Hats are power-ups. And not just power-ups for the sake of power-ups, but power-ups that are tied to their character progression. An example is how Nami's drive to help Vivi leads to her using the climate tact, which has become her signature weapon. Or how Zoro, Sanji, and Chopper gained power-ups at Enies lobby due to their drive to save Robin. And more recently in Wano, we saw Zoro obtain Enma, Sanji gain Jarma 66 enhancements, and my personal favorite, Nico Robin unveiling Demonio Floor to defeat Black Maria. Oda is really great at using power-ups to show how the Straw Hats have evolved throughout the story. And because those power-ups are tied to some personal journey to overcome the conflict of the particular arc, it makes those characters more emotionally resonant. Now, Franky is technically no exception to this, as he, along with the entire crew, obviously got a huge upgrade during the time skip, and his upgrade was a result of his drive to help Luffy become the Pirate King. But the issue is that his new design, along with General Franky, are developments that Franky received off-screen, meaning we lose the satisfaction of seeing him grow in real time like most of the Straw Hats already had, and would continue to do so after. I almost think Oda might have cooked too hard with Franky at the start of the time skip. Every Straw Hat gained new abilities during those 2 years, sure, but for the most part, they still had room to grow, allowing us to still experience the joy of seeing them get buffs as they fought tougher opponents. Franky, on the other hand, was now this cyborg freak who was packing a mech suit that he could pull out whenever he wanted. He got so much off-screen buffs, but there's almost zero room for his character to grow. If you look through Franky's major fights post-time skip, from Icarus to Senor Pink and finally Sasaki, he's been the exact same fighter. He never had to get stronger, he never had to receive any power-ups. The only change in his fighting style was that he couldn't use General Franky against Senor Pink because the Thousand Sunny wasn't within reach. This was especially disappointing in the case of Sasaki, considering how much the Tobi Roppo were hyped up, You'd think this would have been the time for Franky to finally step up his game, but I digress. I think it's really unfortunate that Franky has been left hung out to dry, as in my opinion, he has the greatest potential for interesting power-ups. We're talking about a guy who makes battleships and builds attack robots. There are so many creative ways to write Franky being a sort of scavenger that finds new tech across the various islands he visits and uses them to gain new weapons. Kind of like how Usopp used the dials at Skypiea and integrated them into his sniping arsenal. Maybe Franky could have fashioned a weapon out of Sea Prism Stone from Wano. Who knows? For now, we'll have to settle with the same stagnant character we've had for the past 500 chapters. Now on to my last point. If you ask me, beyond any bias towards the longest tenured Straw Hats, the lackluster introduction at Water 7, or the lack of character progression, there is one much more important reason as to why Franky has been my least favorite crewmate. And that is that Franky has by far the least developed relationship with Luffy out of the entire crew. If you look at all of Franky's interactions with Luffy throughout the series, most of them are either really brief or really lackluster. Biggest example is when Luffy asks Franky to join the crew. This scene is mostly just Luffy playing keep away with Franky's underwear, followed by Franky having a self-reflection before deciding to join the crew. It's not really about Franky and Luffy's dynamic, but more so Franky's past at Water 7. Then you have Dressrosa, where the two of them spend a brief period of time at the start of the arc. Nothing really interesting happens here. Then later, through a Den Den Mushi call, Franky declares that he'll help the Tontaras take down Doflamingo no matter what, leading Luffy to give him his blessing. Now this scene is actually a really nice showcase of their dynamic, but it doesn't even compare to Luffy's dynamic with all the other crewmates. If I just name any other Straw Hat and ask you to think of the most iconic scene that they have with Luffy, you'd basically be going through a list of some of the most iconic moments in the entire series. The Help Me scene between Nami and Luffy, I Want to Live with Robin, Zoro's declaration to never lose again at Baratie, Luffy holding Hiriluk's flag, Luffy vs Usopp, Luffy vs Sanji. Even Jinbei, the most recent addition to the crew, had a great moment after Marineford where he was comforting Luffy after Ace's death. The only other Straw Hat I can't say has had one truly iconic moment with Luffy is Brook, who also tends to be one of the lowest ranked Straw Hats in the polls. But Brook makes up for this through having a great bond with Luffy. He makes him laugh through his skull jokes, and we get a lot of scenes of them just kind of goofing off with one another. Meanwhile, when Luffy and Franky so much as just exchange dialogue, it feels like a novelty. I almost think Oda recognized the lack of interactions the two have, and that's why he had them spend those few chapters together at Dressrosa. Unfortunately, I don't think it was enough. Luffy and Franky interrogating a soldier and registering as a Colosseum gladiator aren't all that riveting. Luffy being the protagonist, of course, he's the audience's perspective character. He's who we experience the story through the eyes of, so his bond with characters matters a lot when determining which characters people like. I'd bet the reason Boa Hancock places so high in the polls is because of how much her love for Luffy resonates with people. I know fans might say it's because she's attractive, but the reality is Oda draws most of his female characters with the same model-like physique, so I don't think a character who appears as infrequently as Boa is getting votes solely because of her appearance. Getting back on point, Franky is sorely lacking pivotal scenes with Luffy, and if he could just get one moment on the same level as an I Want to Live scene, then I think his appreciation by fans and myself might start to change. Well, now that I've explained why Franky is the least popular Straw Hat, let's now ask the question, is there hope for Franky? Could his fortunes change in the final saga? Well, based on the Egghead Island arc so far, it doesn't look great. I don't think I'm alone when I say that Egghead Island seemed like it was bound to be the Franky arc. It's literally set on a science island led by Dr. Vegapunk, a man who Franky spent the time skip studying the research of and idolizing. You would think that this would be the perfect time for Franky to invent some new tech for himself or give him some nice character moments with the scientist. However, the arc has reached a point where it seems the stakes are too high for us to be focusing on Franky, and with the Stella seemingly dead, it looks like we may have to give up hope on Egghead Island being the Franky arc. But do not fear, as looking through the story so far, I believe there is a good chance that we are poised to see at least two pivotal moments for Franky before the series ends. The first one has to do with Franky's new bounty poster. After the Wano arc ended, the Straw Hats all got new bounties, as expected, But what no one could have expected is that Franky's bounty poster no longer displays a photo of General Franky, but the Thousand Sunny instead. It may seem just like an innocent joke, poking fun at how much he values the ship, but I remember the last time Oda made a joke regarding a bounty poster, and that was with Sanji. Now, I don't think anyone expected that to turn into an actual plot point, but that's just one of the ways Oda is so great at foreshadowing. So, with that said, I think there may be a pattern we can identify here. Gonna put my theory crafting hat on here, so brace yourselves. Franky's original bounty poster was of just his face after Water 7, pretty normal stuff. Then after Dressrosa, it was of General Franky, a machine that he pilots. So what if this new bounty poster is foreshadowing the next machine that he will pilot? I'm theorizing that we could see Franky turn the Thousand Sunny into a mech that he'll use in an epic fight. My first guess would be that he'd use it against San Juan Wolf. It just seems like a perfect matchup with his epithet being Colossal Battleship, but I'll be discussing the Blackbeard pirates in a future video, so stay tuned for that. Point is, I think we could be in for Franky getting his first major power-up post-time skip, so that could be really exciting. The last potential Franky moment I could see happening, and one that has honestly seemed set in stone for his character ever since Water 7, is that he'll build Pluton. Now this is a popular fan theory, so I won't pretend to be the first person to come up with it, but the reasoning is really sound. While Pluton is a major Chekhov's gun that hasn't been pulled yet, another major Chekhov's gun in the series is the fact that someone has to build a new Pluton to counter the pre-existing one. It has been a while since I reread the Water 7 saga, but chapter 399 is actually really deliberate in its foreshadowing. Franky tells us that the shipwrights of the past have passed down the blueprints to the ancient weapons specifically to counteract the one created during the Void Century. So considering that Caribou is about to tell the Blackbeard pirates about Pluton being in Wano, maybe we'll get a moment where Luffy has to depend on Franky to build him a new weapon to stop Blackbeard from using it. I'd love to see this happen, as it could also help develop the captain shipwright dynamic that has been really lacking so far. I should also mention that it's very possible to merge the Pluton and Thousand Sunny ideas together. Franky could fashion the Thousand Sunny to become Pluton itself. Who's to say he didn't already use the blueprints when designing their ship? Who knows? While it's likely too late for fan perception of the cyborg pirate to change too dramatically by the end of the series, I do think we are poised for some great Franky moments ahead, possibly his greatest moments in the entire series. We just have to wait and see what Oda cooks up next. In the meantime, hope you liked the video, and if you did, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.